I think we are undergoing a parallel economic and cultural shift around nature. Now, you see it in the papers and in magazines and on social media and in the kinds of books that are stacked up at the entrance at Waterstones. People are yearning for greater connection with nature, and there is this shift towards embracing mess and embracing more self-willed nature in our lives. You've had the Rewilding London Task Force and other cities following suit. And I think the last people for that cultural shift to reach are those who are frightened about what seem like very dramatic, quite scary changes taking place in their landscapes. Communities that have lived in remote landscapes for generations and are farmed in a particular way, they feel under pressure, especially with their subsidies now withdrawn. It's a time of great change. So I agree with you. The economic shift has to go hand in hand with a cultural shift, and some very careful and sensitive messaging needs to come from the nature movement. Do you think, Tony, that the government and its agencies, including Natural England, are keeping up with the shifts that we've been discussing? For example, those who are involved in species reintroductions in the UK, those involved with the return of beavers, for example, might suggest that the government and Natural England in particular are still of a kind of older, more cautious mindset, and that they haven't yet embraced the kind of ambition that you find in places like Kazakhstan, where they're tipping thousands of saiga antelope and wild ass out of the backs of trucks into vast grassland landscapes, and they're looking to bring back cheetahs and so on. And the species reintroductions taking place around the world. The Spanish, with their lynx recovery, have been have performed miracles. In the year 2000, there were maybe 60 or 90 lynx left. Now there's 3,000, and that was all through captive breeding and species reintroduction. So do you think the government's keeping up?
Government is a complex business, of course, and the realm of policy making and passing laws, often is in a different zone compared to, the practical possibilities or what the science tells us. And so this is a constantly shifting context as well. And so we just had a change of government from several Conservative governments, one of which I think was very ambitious on the nature recovery and reintroduction agenda led by Boris Johnson. And then that changed with subsequent prime ministers who were very much less keen on that. And now we're with a new government of a different colour, which is, I think, giving some very positive signals about its appetite for this kind of thing. And it's very interesting, actually, that when I came to Natural England in 2019, I thought, we're very close now to getting a decision on beaver reintroduction in England. It took 6 more years, however, including a change of government to the point where we got this over the line in February 2025 under a new Labour government. So the politics and who's in charge, not only which political party, but also which politician, it does shape this really quite profoundly. At the moment, I do feel as though we're in a better place, although, the public debate, which shapes the politics, is always going to be important, irrespective of who the Secretary of State for the Environment or Prime Minister is. And, you may have seen some remarks I made a few weeks ago, which got printed in The Guardian, about my enthusiasm for lynx reintroduction in England. A huge chorus of opposition and pushback on that, much of it utterly uninformed, but reflecting fears and the resistance to change and the citing of all sorts of consequences that could follow, much of which was unfounded. But nonetheless, it is a set of real reactions which will be noted by politicians as making the subject complicated and therefore needing some caution. And so the fact that we live in this divided, contested country still when it comes to some of this, I think, does cause the politics to go more slowly. And this, Ben, is also, I think, in some large part, a reflection of a crowded country. Pretty much every square metre here has got at least one or multiple kinds of, pressures on it, from farming, from house building, from solar panels, from reservoirs, from roads, all of these different things crowding into the landscape and then adding in the idea that we might wish to have some apex predators back, sometimes it can spark a reaction which you wouldn't get in places like Kazakhstan, where you've got a lot more space and, well, a different politics as well, of course, in terms of how their country works compared with ours. But we do our very best at Natural England to make the case for high ambition when it comes to things like species reintroduction. And I'm hopeful that the new government will, really take this on and see the opportunities that we have to really lead in a crowded country. And actually, leading in a crowded country is more important than leadership coming from a country that's sparsely populated. And we know we have a global emergency, and ministers were out this week saying that the UK should show leadership on climate and nature. And we heard that from Ed Miliband and Steve Reed. And that sentiment of us showing leadership at a time of these global pressures becoming very apparent, I do hope will be reflected in questions like the return of golden eagle, the return of lynx to England being on the agenda in a way which we haven't seen for a while, or indeed ever, actually, in terms of those two species.
Yeah, and in spite of all the political and cultural difficulties, we're in a whole different world here in Britain as compared with where we might have been. If you consider how we felt about things 15 years ago, who'd have believed 15 years ago that we'd have free-living beavers now across a whole number of river catchments in the UK, that we'd have wildcats being reintroduced in a bunch of different places, white storks, white-tailed eagles on the Solent. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening, and I think lots of reasons for optimism. What for you is the most significant good news story since of current times?
I think probably the biggest single thing is what we were discussing a moment ago, was the shift in the agricultural policy, which is being coupled with a grassroots movement of farmers who now are moving into thinking about agriculture differently. And actually, you and I were both at that Groundswell Farming Festival, weren't we, earlier this month in Hertfordshire, where you can see this huge number of people who are producing food coming together for a very different conversation to the kind that you would have heard a few years ago, thinking about soils, thinking about how we blend nature into food production, looking at cutting edge technologies, robotics, AI, drones, being able to minimize chemical use. It does feel like a real revolution is underway. And when you look at that, coupled with some of this big thinking now about land use change, coupled with this realization that we've been battling against for decades, which is this idea that looking after nature gets in the way of economic development and job creation and all these things, we are getting past that too, to understand that nature is essential for our health, wealth and security as a country. And, the more we can blend that into how we decide things, the better. And I do feel as though, we are on the edge now of a big series of changes that over the coming years I think will lead to us looking back on this period maybe from the 2050s and thinking actually that was the turning point. It does feel like that. It's sometimes hard to appreciate in the day-to-day as you look at specific cases of a bit of wetland being drained in order to make way for a road or something, or pressures from house building, but I do think the fundamentals are shifting, and if the fundamentals shift then the outcomes can shift.
And which particular landscape in England underscores that feeling for you, Tony? Where have you stood recently and thought, wow?
Well, one of the places I go, Ben, which is quite close to where I live in Cambridge, it's not the most beautiful landscape in the world, but it is one that gives me enormous hope. And this is a place called Burwell Fen, which sits next to one of the oldest nature reserves in England at Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire. And when I visited Burwell Fen for the first time in the late 1980s, it was a combination of lawn turf being grown, daffodils to make bulbs and cut flowers, and now and again it would have cereals in there. And then in 2002, the National Trust bought it as part of their Wicken Vision, which aims to rebuild the wetlands around Wicken all the way down to Cambridge, some 10 miles away, and to effectively embark on a very significant scale of renaturalisation of the landscape. And so they got hold of Burwell Fen. It's quite a big patch of land. In 2002, they blocked up the drains And since then, the place has become progressively more wild. And I take my dog up there for a walk quite regularly. And during the course of this spring, I've seen multiple bitterns breeding in there. There are great white egrets, little egrets. There are a pair of cranes nesting in there. There are hobbies charging around catching dragonflies. And in the winter, the place is full of flocks of thousands of golden plover and lapwing, huge numbers of widgeon and teal, in what was growing lawn turf and daffodils just a couple of decades ago. And so this just does reveal the incredible capability of nature to bounce back if you remove the pressures. And the pressure there was the removal of the water. Stop taking the water away and that place will become vibrant and alive once more. And the sound of the songbirds in there now every spring, the reed warblers, Chetty's warblers, corn buntings around the edges. There are whitethroats. The place is just absolutely teeming. And of course, this is on peatland. And so a huge amount of carbon that was coming out of the ground is now locked away beneath the water once more. And it's a place to store floodwater in winter as well. And so this is a fine example. And in that landscape, food is still being produced. There are some solar panels in the landscape which are producing electricity. And you can see a combined set of outcomes from sensibly thinking about all of these things that we have to get out of our land, including nature recovery happening right there. And so that gives me a lot of hope, I think, to see and hear that.
I mean, the love in your voice, it's thank God you're chair of Natural England, Tony, someone who just adores it so much. What would your biggest ask be? You know, if you could wave a magic wand and some legislative or regulatory change were to occur in this country, or some shift of some sort that could advance this thing even more, what would it be?
Well, if you look back at the laws that we operate at Natural England, they were passed in the late 1940s. They've been adapted since, and they've been added to by subsequent European legislation, which we still have some of. I think what we need now is a new landmark Act of Parliament to set the vision for the coming 50 to 100 years. And I would have a law called Nature Recovery in a Changing Climate, which would be about exactly the vision that you set out at the beginning, Ben, the Nature Recovery Network, linking up landscapes across the country, truly visionary in restoring nature at scale, but doing that in a way which is going to help the country to thrive in terms of public health, our resilience to climate change, and to be able to secure our water and food security long into the future, because those things are not separate from nature. We depend upon nature for those things. Water held in the land will help us to cope with drought into the future. Pollinating insects, healthy soils, fresh water availability, of course, is vital for food security. So a visionary legislation, piece of legislation coming from the new government called Nature Recovery in a Changing Climate, I think that would be the kind of thing that would be fit for our times. And I do hope that we can convince ministers to take that kind of step.
So please subscribe and tap the notifications bell so you don't miss new content. And to listen to the full podcast episodes, please search for Rewilding the World on whatever app you use to get your podcasts.